Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to another instance of our MOA Live Talk series.
Hey, settle down.
Excuse my background noise here today. I'm Dr. Heather Hatch, and today we're going to be talking about archaeology and popular culture. So before I get into all of that, I'm just going to say again, if you have been watching these series, if you've been following along the kids' crafts and activities that my colleague Katie has been putting together for Monday, Wednesdays, and our Mad Libs on Fridays. If you've been following those along with those and would like to chip in to support us, you can find a link to our donate page in the comments here that I'll be posting shortly. The other thing I wanted to let people know about, if you're not aware, is that we're trying out a new program this summer, since we're not going to be open for our regular kids camps that we usually offer. So instead what we've done is we put together kids camp kits. And so what these are, they are packages of pre-made like craft activities and other activities as well that you can follow along. There will be presentations as well throughout any particular week on the theme of the week. And packets would be mailed out or be able to be picked up in advance at the museum. So it gives you sort of an organized activity for kids to do with their parents, and some additional material to sort of keep them on theme for a week, do a little bit of learning and have a little bit of structured time. If that's the sort of thing you think might be interested in, please do check that out. That's just, there's links on our main website, which is just archaeologymuseum.ca. And I will drop in, as I said, a link in the comments to our donation page, and you can also probably navigate from there to find the kids camp kits. Gosh. All right. So without further ado, I did want to talk about archaeology and popular culture. So I don't want to get bogged down too much in talking about specific instances of depictions of archaeology. I'm sure we can all think of some, but I also think there's enough like generational references to make it difficult to sort of just use examples that will speak to everyone. So I am sure that there are adults out in the world today, for example, who don't even know really who Indiana Jones is, who is sort of our the rock that we always come back to when we're talking about archaeology, popular culture, and what sort of people think about in terms of like what they're learning in pop culture about what archaeology is. So I don't necessarily think that's a fresh reference. I think it's very pervasive and as a depiction that has had a lot of influence and power. But I don't think necessarily it's something that has a lot of meaning to everyone who might be watching this or who's interested in archaeology these days. So what I do want to talk about is some of the tropes and stereotypes that we see in fiction, some of the ways that archaeology is used, and to sort of get a little bit into the pros and cons of these and how I think we can make use of these different portrayals of archaeology. I will be using some examples along the way, so hopefully we won't get too bogged down in that or too lost, and hopefully they'll make sense to people. And I wanted to talk about nonfiction first, partly because it's a little bit less fun in some ways. And so, as a premise to that, or a preface to that, I just want to say that the biggest issue that we have in talking about or how archaeology is depicted in pop culture is that people who are creating these popular references don't necessarily have a good idea of what archaeology is. So the label can get applied in contexts where it's not really appropriate. So there can be a place for this in fiction where you're playing around with different ideas. It's not necessarily intended to be grounded in reality or to depict something that's accurate to real life. But it is more of an issue in nonfiction, where things that are based really more on pseudo-archaeology, if anyone was around for my talk on that last week, which is sort of stuff that sounds like archaeology but doesn't necessarily live up to the standards of archaeological practice and archaeological analysis, and even just plain looting can sometimes get passed off as being archaeology. So things that aren't archaeology are sort of being talked about in the same way, in the same context, and using some of the same language. And this is, like, even more so than questionable fictional accounts of archaeology can be a problem because it is popular culture, right? So it gets attention, and it absolutely affects what people think actual archaeologists do and are like and represent. So it colors the whole perception of the discipline. and it can give bad archaeology or pseudo-archaeology more of a voice in actual, like, legitimate, like, practiced modern archaeological practices, because, again, as I've said before, archaeologists are not always great at presenting their own work in an accessible way. So when the media uses terms like archaeology, archaeologists casually in reference to things like treasure hunters, scavenging valuables off a shipwreck, for example, it can compound that confusion about some of the big ethical problems with looting and non-archaeological approaches to recovering materials and remains from the past. And archaeology and archaeological work can get lumped in with that sort of approach, which then hampers our ability to communicate with communities we might want to work with, and to sort of to find support for the approaches that we're taking, where we're trying to be more respectful, trying to gather more context, and to sort of create an enriching information about the past rather than just recovering things, right? That said, there have been some really good programs out there that do focus on archaeology, modern archaeology, and like archaeological approaches. And like, even when you're watching those, as when you're watching anything on TV, it's important to keep in mind that whatever you're seeing has been carefully edited and produced, and that people are making decisions about what they want to include in that final product that you're seeing. And so there's more going on than just you're going to see in the length of the program, and the decisions about what to show are going to be influenced by what the producers, who are not necessarily archaeologists, even if there are archaeologists involved in the creation of the show, but it's going to like be based on what they think is going to draw an audience. So sometimes that means leaning into or exaggerating conflict and controversy. Sometimes that means overemphasizing conclusions, so focusing more on conclusions where the evidence isn't necessarily as strong as it could be, or as it was hoped to be. So sort of phrasing things in a way that makes them sound more strong, more supportive than they actually necessarily are by the research that's been carried out. It could also mean, a bit of staging things for the camera, by which I don't mean necessarily that things are being faked, but if you're watching a show where they're doing like live archaeology, there can be a little bit of, oh, maybe let's just put that cool artifact back where you found it so that we can call a camera crew over, and maybe we can have it be discovered by some of the main like protagonists or like main characters or featured people on the show, just again because it makes better television. It creates a better narrative about the archaeology that's being done. So that's fine. Like, it's just important to be aware of that, like, even if you're watching something that's being created for television about what archaeology is, there's always all these critical things you should be keeping in your head. And that's true really when you're watching any kind of program that's claiming to be true, claiming to be documentary, and so on and so forth. However, the more of these kinds of programs there are where they are focusing on what archaeologists do, showing fieldwork, talking to experts, giving those opportunities to show the kinds of ways that archaeologists approach these different questions that they have, those are all good, and they give us something to compare to when people are watching shows that are just using sort of that claim of being archaeology or making references to archaeology where it might not necessarily really carry that depth of experience, the analysis and the methods and so forth that really go into it. You're looking more at pseudo-archaeology, where people are just sort of using it to back up claims that they want to be true, those sorts of things. So it gives people more of a context for understanding what archaeology involves. I do want to make a reference here to Time Team, which in the UK is probably a lot better known program, although I'm not actually sure if it's still running. It ran for quite a long time. It's a common frame of reference for people who aren't archaeologists to have sort of an in to understanding what archaeology does, the kinds of questions it asks. And it was a really sort of interesting format, where you had this sort of everyman presenter, Tony Robinson, who was a famous actor and comedian, who sort of was really interested in archaeology and put together this show where he brought in a lot of actual archaeologists and experts to sort of ask a question in a limited amount of time to do a short focused excavations to see what they could find. And again, there were problems with the and a lot of archaeologists I talked to in the UK at the time had some problems with the show about how it depicted what was done, how it chose the sites it was going to choose, some of the things that they had to do in terms of their field methodology in order to get to the archaeology they wanted to show on the program and the time that they had. So, you know, again, it wasn't perfect, but at the same time, it did create a really good platform for helping inform the public more generally in an approachable way about what archaeology was and what archaeologists did. And so, on the whole, I think it probably was a good, I can't think of the right term right now, but like it was good PR for archaeology, regardless maybe of some of the issues that were happening, or that people perceived to have with it, did have with the show, based on their perceptions of how it was being carried out. So these sorts of things are important and they're useful, but again, we have to think about how we're using them and what their role is, right? So the role of a show about archaeology is not necessarily just to do the archaeology. It's to give people that access to the discipline and to help explain what it does, to show what archaeologists do and who we are, and these kinds of questions, the expertise that's involved, and, you know, these different perceptions and approaches to answering these different kinds of questions. So that is a really valuable thing that these kinds of programs can have. And again, it helps sort of offset some of these other perceptions that are out there about what archaeology is, right? So that's really useful, and it's great when these kinds of programs gain a lot of popularity. However, there are, again, there are problematic instances of these kinds of programs that are claiming to do archaeology as well. So the more good programs that are out there, the better balance there is for people to sort of judge about what our discipline really is. Now, when we're talking about fiction, there hasn't really been a big blockbuster movie or like video game or comic or whatever, like really recently, where archaeology has been a main focus. But they certainly are out there, and they still have an enduring, like older ones, again, like Indiana Jones, still have an enduring impact on public perceptions about what archaeology is and what archaeologists do. So things like Indiana Jones, the Mummy movies, Tomb Raider, which is both a video game and a movie franchise now, are really sort of famous for having these archaeologist characters, right? And so it sets up, it also shows up, archaeology also shows up in a lot of like B-list horror movies, usually when archaeologists have meddled with something that they should not have. And this is really where I want to break down and talk about some of these tropes and perceptions about archaeology and how they affect how the public perceives archaeology and how it reinforces these perceptions, right? So first of all, just to be clear, when I'm talking about tropes, what I'm talking about are like common story elements that are sort of encountered over and over. When it comes to archaeologists, there's really two stock types that form the basis of an archaeologist character, right? Though of course you do get variations on this theme and different interpretations and so on and so forth. Really, it goes back to these sort of, or I feel it goes back to these sort of two main stereotypes or tropes. So the first is the adventurer or explorer type. So this is, again, it's your Indiana Jones, your Lara Crofts, these kinds of characters. So you get archaeology as sort of dangerous, exciting, exotic. It deals very much with the other. So it involves fighting over cool artifacts. Usually if the character in question is a protagonist as opposed to an antagonist, you have sort of an element of heroism involved. So they're rescuing objects from danger and taking them somewhere safe, right? So it's that sort of like good guy perception, right? So in older versions, like Indiana Jones, that often means putting them into a white colonial institution like a museum. Although in some cases, especially in sort of more modern, more aware interpretations, that might be returning them to the people that they're taken from. So, and in some cases, also, like the people who are embodying these tropes, these characters, might not actually even be actual archaeologists, or the line, again, between archaeologist and treasure hunter can be a bit blurry. So as I was saying with archaeology and nonfiction, this comes down to a public perception of what archaeology is and what archaeologists do. And so both of these kinds of popular depictions sort of reinforce those perceptions, that idea of treasure hunting, going after objects and so forth, valuing objects, and then that idea of putting them where they belong, right? So that's what an archaeologist does. And that place might not be with the people of the culture that's being represented by said object. So the other common trope that we also see a lot of is sort of the archaeologist as sort of a stuffy know-it-all nerd, right? So they have a lot of book smarts, but maybe not a lot of worldly experience. So some examples of this might be Evie O'Connell from The Mummy, if you're familiar with those movies, although I guess she's technically a librarian. And then maybe Daniel Jackson from the Stargate series, especially towards the beginning and in the movies. So they're academics. They don't necessarily they're not portrayed as having a lot of people skills. They can be seen as sort of naive or standoffish. Sometimes, again, if they're not necessarily playing into that hero role, they might be even like just straight out mean. They're generally less physically capable than their more adventurous counterpart, but they still get drawn into whatever like plot or story they're supposed to be having a role in, right? So which often involves adventure, whether or not they're actually actively trying to seek it out. So this is really where we see the stereotype of an archaeologist as a specialist and a member of the educated elite. And it tends to reflect, so again, popular views about academics more widely. So like there's a lot of that, you know, archaeologists seeking knowledge without considering the consequences, right? So and this sort of ties into the other thing we see a lot, which is not necessarily about the archaeologist's characters, but about how archaeology is used as sort of a plot device, right? So usually it's following a trope where archaeologists have done something naughty, like ignore a warning or a curse, or generally mucked about with forces of the unknown. So there's kind of a classic Onion, if you're familiar with the Onion, the satire media platform. They have a classic article about this, which is titled "Archaeologists Tired of Unearthing Unspeakable Ancient Evils." And it's, you know, just sort of goes into that idea that, you know, oh, archaeologists have dug something up that they shouldn't, right? So sometimes archaeology can also provide some sort of like plot MacGuffin, like an object or something that needs to be found or something that needs to be recovered. So it's something that pushes the story along. And it can also set up sort of mysteries of problems that need to be solved, which usually involves getting a lot more concrete answers about things that happened in the past in a way that real archaeology is not really capable of, right? So you're setting up archaeology as sort of a premise that there's some ancient thing that we want to know about, and that this is maybe an approach to doing it, but then their actual depictions of archaeology is not necessarily really accurate. So they don't really have necessarily much to do with the reality of archaeology. It tends to focus on things that are more exciting, more interesting, and even the things that where it's meant to be like representations of things that maybe supposed to be more boring. It's more about like ancient books and manuscripts and writing rather than field work, for example, or spending hours looking at pieces of broken pottery or weighing pieces of broken stone. So it's not, even the things that are supposed to be boring don't necessarily really represent what archaeologists are actually doing in the field or in the lab or in their research, right? So again, these can all reinforce stereotypes of archaeology being a very colonial practice. So especially in scenes, if they're showing the labor, like the actual work, if they are showing it at all, of archaeology being performed by people of color or locals in exotic locations, well, white archaeologists are there supervising. So it reinforces this sort of power dynamic that does not represent what we usually, what we see in archaeology in the field really today. Or hopefully not. So even when they're not necessarily trying to play into these stereotypes, they often wind up setting the heroes as sort of like this white savior, right? So they're there to save the object or whatever, right? Or also you get into them championing these objects over people, which is, again, just a different kind of problem, a different kind of colonial valuation of things over people, right? It also, these depictions can also reinforce the idea of archaeology itself being something that is of the past or stuck in the past. And so you're sort of glorifying this sort of antiquarian adventurer collector, right? So antiquarianism being this idea that I talked about, I think, a couple times in some of these other talks about, you know, this approach to collecting, to having things, and that sort of perspective at the time, so in like the late 19th, early 20th century, really being about the value of collecting, about the exploration and that authority that comes with having things and having those experiences. So a lot of these depictions where you're setting archaeology up as something of the past, it's really kind of reinforcing that old perspective about what archaeology is and how it's performed, right? That said, despite a lot of these problems that you can see in a lot of these depictions, and I mean, just to go off on a little bit of a sidebar here, even when you're looking at archaeology as fictionalized archaeology, so if you're looking at it in like a fantasy or a science fiction setting, which you do get, because people want to take that concept of learning about the past through things and apply it to different settings, the way that that's depicted a lot of the time still draws on these tropes that are based in antiquated ideas about what archaeology is, right? So you're still seeing these tropes represented in these settings that are not necessarily meant to be realistic at all. And so what any of these kinds of portrayals can give us is really, it's a conversation starter. So it still gives us a way in. It gives us something that people are interested in, that we can relate back to what archaeologists are actually doing and create conversations and sort of spread more information about what archaeology actually is. So it's an opportunity, even if we're like out there being like, nobody wears a whip or like out in the field, that's ridiculous. Like, and archaeologists aren't carrying guns out into the field on like their regular everyday like experiences. Maybe if you're like up like north and you're like worried about bears, you might be armed for those kinds of contexts, but generally not a big concern. So having these, but like it still gives us that opportunity to say these things, right? To be like, well, this character is cool, this character is fun, or this story is interesting, but it's not really necessarily what archaeologists are really doing, right? So it gives us that conversational in, that something that the public is interested in, that we can relate back to our actual work. So it still can be valuable to archaeology. And I think there's another aspect that's important to talk about as well, and that's where archaeology is used to inform popular culture. So where it's used to help build and enrich a setting by including details about the past that we know about through archaeology. And here again, you can get kind of a mixed bag of execution of the concept, but it is a neat way of providing engagement and of giving archaeological research meaning in new contexts and new platforms, sharing that knowledge that archaeologists have more broadly, right? So I said I was going to try not to get too bogged down in examples, and I think I've done more or less a pretty good job about that, talking more generally, but I do want to bring up one specific example here, just because I thought when it came out, it was really interesting and innovative, and that's what Ubisoft, which is a video game company that's behind the really popular Assassin's Creed games, has done with some of their work in that franchise. So for people who aren't familiar, this is a game with several different titles that are all linked to different time frames, so historical periods, that are set in, or partially set at least, in these different historical periods. So the game developers frequently put a lot of research into those settings to create a really immersive experience for the players who get to go running around in and on different famous landmarks in pursuit of the story and of different game achievements as well. So one of the more recent games that they came out with in this series was actually set in ancient Egypt. And once again, they really dove into that research very deeply, including hiring cultural consultants to help prep the team, like as they were creating their story even, with a framework of historical and archaeological knowledge that would help them make the best, most accurate digital recreations of ancient places, but also of ancient cultures. So they were recreating places that we know about from archaeology and using information that we have from archaeology about like how buildings were constructed, what they looked like on the inside, to try and recreate some places in the past that have not necessarily survived, that we can't just go to directly, to sort of take that information and then I lost the word, but to sort of project from that knowledge that we have from archaeology, from historical research, from other Egyptology sources, and to use that to create something that was meant to be an accurate as possible representation of the ancient world. But then they took all this work that they had done making the setting for this game, and they did something even more interesting with it, which is that they created what they called discovery tours, where they took all these digital assets they'd made and all the research that they'd put into the game and created a platform that was just meant for people to explore the ancient world and to learn more about it. So people can virtually explore these ancient cities that they have recreations of, and they can learn more about the peoples and cultures from anything from like daily life to myths that we know about from these ancient cultures, and even like just architectural details. So they can go into these spaces, not necessarily for the plot or the story and to follow the characters, but just purely to learn about the setting that was created. And this is really, I think, a fascinating thing for them to have invested in as a company that's really out there to make video games and make money off of people buying them, right? But it also relates to some of the things I've talked about us doing here at the museum a little bit. Obviously, we don't have quite the same level of resources available to us. But what they did was that when they took these elements that they created for the game, so these digital assets, and they recontextualized them into a learning environment where the elements of character and story were stripped away, right? So they already had them, they collected them, they'd done all the research, and this just allowed them to capitalize on the work they already have after they decided to make those commitments to having that background in their games, right? And so when we're talking about things that we're doing here at the museum, when we're talking about digital scanning and so forth, it's about the ability to recontextualize that stuff and to put it into new contexts also, right? So we want to be able to do the same thing, like say, hey, look, here's a cool model of an artifact, like maybe it's a projectile point, for example, that you can look at. But now let's take that projectile point and let's put it into a context where you can see like a video, or you can see where it was found maybe, or the context in which it was found, or give some information about the context about how it might have been used. So really the sort of digital development opens a lot of these different doors to possibilities. And so that's one of the reasons that that we're sort of invested in that technology to some extent, although again, not quite the same level of resources. But in terms of popular culture and archaeology, I just think it's a really fascinating example of the possibilities that are out there for how archaeology is used to inform popular culture, and then how that can come back and turn it around as well. So there's a lot of really interesting conversations, I think, that are possible out there, especially in a digital world where we're creating these kinds of things already, where there's, I think, potentials for really interesting partnerships and sharing of knowledge. And then again, that opportunity to present it in different ways that make it more accessible to people, and then that can be used to create these new conversations about archaeological work, what archaeology is, and what archaeologists do. And that, I think, is valuable, and hopefully was interesting for you guys to think about. As ever, if anybody has any questions, please, I guess I'm at the end of my talk now, but feel free to leave them in the comments and I will get back to you, and I'll be dropping in that donation link here in a moment as well. So thanks again, and we'll be seeing you next week. I believe we are going to be sharing something a little bit different for at least one of our live talk slots next week, which is actually an interview that was done with Dr. Neil Ferris and some other prominent archaeologists from the field in Ontario. So that's Dr. Bill Fox and Dr. Ron Williamson. Wait. Well, anyway, so we'll be sharing sort of a conversation that they've recorded about Ontario archaeology and how it's changed over time. Hopefully we'll have that for you next week. And then I have a couple of potential topics that I'll be talking about next week. I know at some point this month, since it is Pride Month, I'd like to talk a little bit about queer archaeology, and maybe also take, an approach and talk about some things we've heard about recently in the news, like, for example, or this coming back up, I guess, in the news. There was an archaeologist in Alabama who sort of put out some information about, like, this is what I would do if I were thinking about destroying a monument, for example, and sort of the backlash about that, some context about monument creation, monument destruction in a historical context, rather than just talking about it today. So that was something that some friends of mine suggested to me might be of interest, and hopefully other people will find that interesting as well. And then the other thing I wanted to mention, if anybody's listening to this, is another thought we'd had about what a direction to go with these live talks, is maybe to invite more of a conversation here about Ontario archaeology. So, excuse me. there have been several good books written about topics, like broad general topics in Ontario archaeology, and we're thinking about maybe having sort of more of a discussion format where people could read sections of a book or chapters or even some articles together, and then maybe have people like call in a small group over Zoom or something similar and broadcast a conversation about those topics in archaeology. So if you think that sounds interesting, please let me know. I'll probably be putting a post out on our webpage also to see if that's the sort of thing that somebody might be interested in either participating in or watching. And otherwise, we'll see you. We'll be back next week with more live talks, and of course Katie will continue to be giving her content on the kids' crafts and activities, and tomorrow I hope you will join us for Mad Libs at 10 o'clock. So thanks and have a great afternoon.